Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Richard Ovenden. I have the pleasure and privilege of being Bodleian's librarian, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Bodleian Library this evening for the opening of our winter exhibition, North Sea Crossings. And this, like many other events at this time, for COVID reasons, is being done in hybrid fashion. So we are delighted to welcome a select but socially distanced gathering here in the Sir Victor Blank Lecture Theatre in the Western Library, but also a crowd in the cloud who are coming to join us virtually for this hybrid event. It is a particular pleasure to welcome His Excellency Carl Jan Gustaf van Oosterom, the Dutch Ambassador to the Bodleian this evening, who will formally open the exhibition in a few moments' time. Allow me just to say a very few words about the exhibition. North Sea Crossings traces the long history of Anglo-Dutch relations as exemplified chiefly from Oxford and the Bodleian's collections. The exhibition is a pioneering collaborative project between the Bodleian and scholars from the University of Bristol and the University of Cambridge in partnership with Flash of Splendour, an Oxford-based educational non-profit working to empower disabled, marginalised and disadvantaged children and young people through music, film, art and creative writing. This exhibition has been generously funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and I would like to express our thanks to them for their strong support. The show focuses on the period from the Norman Conquest in 1066 to the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and draws on items from the Bodleian Library's collections which illustrate the ways in which these exchanges have helped shape literature and culture, book production, and indeed on cultural and intellectual institutions such as the Bodleian itself, on either side of the North Sea. Through the exhibition, we invite visitors to reflect on the way this cultural exchange still impacts British and Dutch societies today. We've been fortunate to work with a talented curatorial team who've not only worked on the exhibition, but also on the lavishly illustrated book which accompanies the show. The book has been timed, ladies and gentlemen, perfectly for you to be able to fulfill your Christmas shopping needs. I encourage you to visit the Bodleian shops here in Oxford or our online shop, just Google Bodleian shop, where you can purchase this beautiful publication and indeed other related materials such as Anna Louise Avery's acclaimed translation of Reynard the Fox, which our brilliant publishing team have also produced. Any project of this kind, featuring an exhibition, book and related academic conferences and other events, is a major undertaking. The curatorial team deserve great praise and thanks for their compelling idea for the project, but also for their great skill and creativity in bringing it to fruition, despite there being a global pandemic. They've worked very closely with my colleagues in Bodleian's exhibitions and public engagement teams, in Bodleian Publications, and with our front of house colleagues, who as ever have worked very collaboratively. And I'd like to thank my colleagues and the curatorial team very much. Ladies and gentlemen, there are numerous reasons why this exhibition and its theme give me great pleasure. The first, of course, is that our founder, Sir Thomas Bodley, was for many years the English ambassador in the Netherlands. And so we have that sort of deep in our DNA in this institution. But also, I grew up in East Kent, and the vernacular architectural style I was taught from a very early age by my artisan family included Dutch bond as a way of laying bricks. And so that is also seared in my memory of looking at those beautiful 16th and 17th century buildings in the villages around where I grew up. And it gives me great pleasure to think of those exchanges of individuals, of people crossing that short gap of the channel. But this show is also part of a series of projects reaffirming our, both Oxford and the Bodleians, deep and long-lasting connections with Europe. We collaborated here in the Bodleian with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France on our Tolkien show, which ended its tour in Paris in 2018. We've just completed a project with the Herzog August Bibliothek in Germany on digitising medieval manuscripts from German-speaking lands, and we undertook an even bigger collaboration with the Vatican Library 5 years before that. The Bodleian was, from its foundation, a European institution, deeply intertwined with the Republic of Letters, and with strong connections to the Dutch-speaking world, especially to Leiden University. Our first readers came not just from Oxford, not just from England, but from across Europe, and indeed from further afield too. It is enormously important to us here in Oxford to remember and celebrate our ties to Europe, and to re-establish connections to scholars, students, and to intellectual and cultural institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Dutch Ambassador.
Don't you hate those masks as well? These are not government supplied, but they are orange, which is our national color. So I supply at home. First of all, thank you very much for those very kind words, Richard. What a pleasure it is to be here. Am I audible in the back? And Emily, can you hear me as well? Good. I had the privilege of already visiting this beautiful exhibition at the other side of this wall. And I had this whole prepared speech, and I thought, this is a literary environment, this is about books. So I've structured my speech spontaneously along 5 letters, the first 5 letters of the alphabet. A, B, C, D, and A. Is that okay? So forget about the official stuff, I'm just going to say something along these letters. First, the A, of course, stands for amazing. What an amazing exhibition. And let me pay tribute to, and now I need my glasses, to Ad Putter, Sjoerd Leveld, Anne-Louise Avery, who is not here, but certainly Lisbeth van Houten and also Bart van der Esch, who is on our panel, and Emily at home, partly for being for being here tonight with us, but also for most of them for helping organize, curate this wonderful, amazing exhibition. So that's the A of amazing. The B, of course, stands for
Bodleian.
Bodleian.
No.
That's very good. Bodleian.
Belgium.
Belgium, very good. So Bodleian. There's a third word which is not to be mentioned in the UK, but I'm going to mention it. So the Bodleian, what a pleasure as a Dutch ambassador to be here in a long tradition, as Richard, as you mentioned just now. Belgium, which of course the southern part of the Nederland from the old times. And part of this exhibition, for instance, Reinoud de Vos, is about Flanders. The language comes from there, and of course we share the language with Flanders, and we divide it by the same language as the UK is with the US on the other language. And so the B stands for Belgium, also stands of course for the Bodleian, but also for Brexit. Any speech I give anywhere, I will try to say something positive about Brexit. We missed the UK horribly. You were our best friends in the European Union. Our king said the same in 2018. We hope you come back. And meanwhile, while Brexit is going on and you're not part of the European Union, we will remain the best friends of the United Kingdom in Europe. And we will continue to be what we call North Sea neighbors. We are a gateway to Europe, and we hope to see you back. I mean, it's the most strategic hope we have for the United Kingdom. At the same time, we have the C. The C stands for
Crossings.
Crossings, very good. C stands for, come on, culture. And stands for connections. Culture continues to connect us. And the last time Emily and we saw each other was at the Scheepvaartmuseum in the Maritime Museum in Amsterdam, where we were together at the opening of a beautiful exhibition of the Van der Velde, the elder and the younger, beautiful sea paintings of a different time in our relationship when there were the English-Dutch wars. We don't fight anymore since then. But beautiful paintings, both from the Dutch as from the English perspective. And that culture continued to connect. Last month I was in Dordrecht. If you're ever in the Netherlands the coming time, go to Dordrecht and visit the Albert Cuyp exhibition, which shows Albert Cuyp paintings and how he has influenced major artists such like Turner and Constable. The use of the skies, the meadows, the cattle. And of course, if you're in London, go to the Wallace Foundation. It is an amazing Frans Hals exhibition. And culture continues to connect us, and these are just a few examples. And like in 2 years' time, you can go to Greenwich if you don't go Holland, and in 2 years' time in the Maritime in Greenwich, you'll have a wonderful Van der Velde exhibition as well. So that was the C. The D, of course, stands for the Dutch. That's the Dutch and the Dutch language. And to make my point, I first have to check something. My understanding is that a monk, when he lives in a monastery, is celibate. Is that correct? He cannot marry. Is that correct? That's okay. So I was in the gymnasium when I was young, and then I learned that the first sentence in Dutch, which you can see now in this exhibition, is, of course, and this I cannot do from my head, is, where is it? Hebben alla vogela nestas hagonam hinase hic anda tu wat bidan renu. I will try to translate it. The experts here can do it much better. All birds have started to settle by the nest, and when can we finally start? To whom was this monk talking?
Big riddle.
Maybe you can answer that question later on during the panel. It's like this monk, celibate, living in a monastery, and is talking to whom to build a nest together. I don't know, it always continues to surprise me. When driving down, I looked this up. I found that my namesake, Frits van Oostrom, has had the position that this might have been a lady who wrote it. It came from Persian tradition. I'm really looking to the forward and challenge you to explain what the monk was trying to do. There was a D of Dutch, of course. Maybe the E is, of course, of excitement we all feel about this exhibition. Excitement that afterwards you'll be able to see it. And even more important, maybe, E stands for anyone else? Embassy. As an embassy, we will continue to work as hard as we can to connect the citizens of our two countries, our companies, our civil servants, our cabinet members, but first and foremost, cultural aficionados like you. So if I could ask you to join me in a warm round of applause for the curators, for a member of panelists, and by applauding, we'll open the exhibition together.
That was very well said indeed, Ambassador. Thank you very much for those words. I would now like to introduce Dr. Sjoerd Leveld, who is a researcher at the University of Bristol on the Leverhulme Trust-funded project, The Literary Heritage of Anglo-Dutch Relations, circa 1050 to 1600, who, with Ad Putter, Louise Avery, and our team at the Bodleian, of course, curated this exhibition. He will be moderating this panel as well as making his own contributions. So I hand over to him.
Thank you very much, Richard. Just to check whether I'm audible, yeah, and also at home. Yes, perfect. Okay, thank you so much, Richard, for your kind introduction and for opening the spaces of the Western Library and making available the collections of the Bodleian Libraries to our project, North Sea Crossings. It has been really a joy to work here. It has been a long time in the making, hasn't it? I remember meeting you here in Weston Hall as I arrived at the Western Library for our first planning meeting, our very first planning meeting in an age when such meetings were still in person. And that was the morning of the 24th of June 2016. Your words to me on that morning that the outcome of the referendum for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union became clear were, we have to make this happen. And here we are. Thank you very much for that. So on behalf of the project, I want to express our many thanks to you personally and to the Bodleian Libraries and staff who have been indispensable in making the exhibition and the accompanying book happen. There are too many to mention, and more crucially, there are many who have contributed without us even being aware that they were contributing. So, but I do want to thank specifically Maddie Slaven and Sally-Ann Gilchrist, who have done more than anyone, I think, to ensure that we were able to translate our research into a format here in the exhibition room that was new to us. Special thanks to our collaborators, Flash of Splendor, whose work on Reynard Fox you will be able to see in and around the exhibition and online, and whose work is still growing. And in particular, our co-curator, Anne-Louise Avery, whose retelling of Reynard de Fox, and there's another book I can show you, whose retelling of Reynard de Fox I cannot recommend highly enough. It truly is fantastic. In that context, I also need to thank the National Lottery Heritage Fund for making all of this possible with their funding. I thank our project co-investigators, Lisbeth van Houts and Maurice Rapsada. It is a true privilege to work with you. And thank you, Ambassador van Oostrom, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here with us, and for your kind words of introduction. You have already noted that we in the project take Dutch to mean Dutch speaking, and therefore covering a wider area than just the Netherlands. Nevertheless, your presence here highlights the significance of Anglo-Dutch relations to the people of England and the Netherlands, not only historically, but also presently. Thank you very much. To introduce the exhibition, North Sea Crossings, Anglo-Dutch Books and the Adventures of Reynard de Fox, it is an honor to be joined today by the following, and I'll give some short introductions before we get started. Emily Gordenker, who is here with us online, is the General Director of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. She was previously Director of the Mauritshuis, and before that the Senior Curator of Early Netherlandish, Dutch and Flemish Art at the National Gallery of Scotland. She is a specialist of 17th century art, and specifically researched Anthony van Dyck, who has a painting in our exhibition. It will be a joy to hear her talk about Van Dyck. Bart van Es is Professor of English Literature at the University of Oxford and Senior Tutor at St. Catherine's College. His research into early modern literature touches on many things, but focuses also in particular on the work of Edmund Spenser, who had an Anglo-Dutch beginning, which we may be talking about. He's in the book. He's not in the exhibition, I'm afraid, but he is in the book. So do get the book as well. In addition, he is himself a celebrated author whose 2018 book, The Cutout Girl, A Story of War and Family Lost and Found, won the COSTA Biography of the Year Award and subsequently the COSTA Book of the Year Award for 2018. Thank you for being here. And then we have Ad Putter, who is a professor of medieval English literature at the University of Bristol and the principal investigator of the Leverhulme Trust-funded research project that I'm also a part of, the Literary Heritage of Anglo-Dutch Relations circa 1050 to circa 1600. Which is the academic partner in the collaboration which produced this exhibition. Ad and I co-wrote, with a number of contributing authors to whom we are also thankful, the exhibition book, North Sea Crossings. Today we will each say some words about the role of Anglo-Dutch relations in our own respective personal and or professional lives. And then we will each talk about one exhibition item that spoke to us personally, and conclude with a conversation around the theme Anglo-Dutch Meetings 1066 to 2022, exploring the literary heritage on display in the exhibition within the broader context of Anglo-Dutch relations in modern life, politics, art and literature, and celebrating what over the centuries has been a special relationship. In this final part, we will also invite from the audience here in the room and online your comments and questions to guide our conversation. And I'll say something about how to do that online once we get there. So we're starting our conversation by presenting ourselves with some indication of the role Anglo-Dutch relations have played in our own lives, professional and or personal. And I'll start for myself. I grew up in Amsterdam, and England was the destination of my first holiday without parents. It seemed the safest choice. My friend and I could make the North Sea crossing quite easily from Hoek van Holland to Harwich, and we knew the language. Or at least we thought we knew the language. Arriving in Essex, you soon realized that the English you learned in the Netherlands isn't quite the English spoken in England. In my academic career, in which I've spent much time studying Dutch historical texts, while based in England, and in departments which have no particular history of engaging with literature in Dutch. I've been struck both by the proximity, as for example shown by the availability of Dutch historical texts in British libraries such as the Bodleian, but also a certain distance. The disciplines of the study of medieval Dutch literature and the study of medieval English literature, for example, have long developed mostly in isolation from each other. There are notable exceptions to this, but mostly in isolation from each other, even when subject to some of the same influences. So it was my aim with this project to open up new routes of connection between those two. So that is it for me here today. Can I ask Emily to tell us something about? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. I know your technical people are working very hard on this. I can't see you right now, so I'm literally flying blind.
Okay.
But I'm sure they'll find a solution soon. Well, let me first say thank you so much, all of you, for the invitation, Richard and the panel. I wish I could be there in person. As an art historian and someone who works in a museum, there's nothing worse than not quite seeing an exhibition. It's always the best when you see the objects in real life. But given all the travel restrictions, it seemed wisest for me to join you in this way. As you can hear from my accent, I'm not English at all. I'm not Scottish. I'm very American. I was born in the US, but with a Dutch mother. And so one of my favorite party tricks is, excuse me, all you Dutch people, to talk like this, because this is how my mother always talked at home. In a sense, I was brought up on both sides of the Atlantic, but my doctoral research took me to the UK, and specifically, I was working on the issue of dress and clothing as it was represented in the 17th century, and that brought me to Anthony van Dyck, about whom more later, and that brought me to the court of Charles I. So I'm very happy to say that I subsequently later moved to London, where in spite of my American accent, I was often told, well, you're okay anyway. And from London, I moved to Edinburgh, which, as you heard, I was a curator at the National Gallery of Scotland there. And interestingly, when I moved to Scotland, my Dutch relative said to me, oh, that's a good thing, because the Scots are much more like us than the English. I leave you to fill in the rest of that. But in fact, it's been a leitmotif for me throughout my professional career, the relationship between the UK more generally and the Netherlands. And that continues to this very day. As many of you know, Vincent van Gogh spent a little time in London, and his works were avidly collected right from early on by British collectors. So that strong relationship remains to me today on a personal and a professional level. So I thought I'd leave it at that. I hope that's okay, Sjoerd.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to see that develop as well over time. Bart.
Thank you, Sjoerd. Yeah, I suppose like all of us, my identity sits somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic. I started being brought up in English abroad. I went to an English school in Indonesia, kind of former Dutch colony, and then ended up going to British school and British university and falling in love with British literature, above all Shakespeare, which is what I teach now. But if I'm asked to kind of think of one moment in my career that really has made me reflect a lot about why the Netherlands, it's important for me, it has been the writing of The Cutout Girl, which you referred to in your introduction. The book is a very personal story. It's the story of a Jewish girl who lived in hiding with my grandparents in the town of Dordrecht during World War II, and I'd sort of always been aware that there was that story in the family, but had known almost nothing about it beyond that. And then in 2014, the death of my eldest uncle, Kees, kind of sparked me suddenly to think I've got to recover this history. And, you know, it particularly in terms of Anglo-Dutch relations, I found it something very moving. I met Lien that year, and she started telling me this, astonishing story of surviving the war in hiding in 9 different places over the course of World War II, starting out with my grandparents and actually ending up with my grandparents as an adoptive child at the end of the war. And as soon as I had that story, I felt really compelled to research it, and I decided to start working in Dutch archives on particularly kind of the collaboration amongst Dutch police in the town of Dordrecht that led to her nearly being captured, led to my grandfather ending up in a concentration camp. And I think my experience doing that was really one of continually being in 2 places. On the one hand, being a kind of Englishman abroad, seeing this country that feels kind of more modern to me than the UK, seems in a certain way more straightforward and honest, yet on the other hand has more secrets about the war than the UK does. And so in one sense, I was very much seeing the Netherlands as a foreigner through English eyes, but now since then I've also ended up explaining the Netherlands to the Brits and feeling more Dutch through that. So it's really become now a kind of leitmotif of how I think about culture, and how I think about, in particular, how World War II has shaped these 2 countries which have so much in common, and yet are also in certain ways kind of opposite twins. They've just gone that different way. In particular, I guess, the kind of oppositeness of the way that the British constantly reflect on their role during World War II and how it's kind of distorted British politics and may indeed be partly responsible for Brexit. And I think, contrary to that, a way in which the Dutch have hidden a great deal of what went on, and that's partly what my book's about.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, my English roots go a long way back. I was born and bred in the Netherlands, but my mum and dad were both English teachers. And if there were things that they didn't want the kids to hear, they would switch to English. And this was a real incentive to learn the language from a very young age. So I started learning English quite young, just to understand what my parents were saying to each other. And then I moved here, a bit like Bart, I think. I fell in love with English literature, especially the old stuff. And I think I have only recently begun to realize that one of the attractions of studying the earlier English literature, I mean Anglo-Saxon, Old English and Middle English, for me is that the kinds of sounds that the English used to make are so like the sounds that the Dutch still make, so that I find myself at an advantage, I think, being a Dutchman, working on this stuff. And I think when you look around you and think of the English people, the Dutchmen, I mean, that are working in academia, in English literature departments, I think they often work on early stuff. And maybe that relationship, that close relationship between the 2 languages has something to do with that. So.
Fascinating. So to give viewers both here, but especially also viewers at home, a little bit of an impression of our exhibition, I've asked each of you to select one item from the exhibition and say something about what made you choose this as a standout item of the exhibition. And we'll start with Ad, actually, on that note. So if we can have the first slide, please.
Yeah, this is my item. This is Douws 365. And the first thing I just say about it, isn't it stunning? It is an absolutely stunning image. And this is Flemish art at its height. We're in the late 15th century. And the picture here shows Margaret of York, an English princess who became Duchess of Burgundy by marriage through Charles the Bold, and what was really the celebrity marriage of the 15th century. So it's a kind of Anglo-Dutch alliance that we see here. Charles was mostly not at home, but the illuminator found it tactful to represent him right at the back. A very handsome man, I think. And the interest of the picture for me, I think there are 3 points. One is just the sheer beauty of the art, and I mean both the illumination, what I like about it is just the kind of restrained and tactful use of colour. It's largely monochrome, but it makes the colour stand out. I find this demi-grisaille, I think is the technical term for it, really stunning. The handwriting is something else. This is the top Flemish scribe working in Ghent, David Aubert, whose handwriting influenced print. Basically, this was the font, if you like, that early printers wanted to imitate. So from that point of view, I think it's just a stunning one. Historically, Margaret of York is just absolutely fascinating. Here is a woman who was really on top of the world. She is represented here as a pious woman, and she was a great patron of arts, and it's very good to see her represented there with a book. She herself had quite an impressive library of books. But the other thing you need to know of Margaret of York is that she was very formidable, and she must have been just a thorn in the flesh of the Tudors, because she would send the odd pretender king over, including Burke and Warbeck, just to annoy the Tudors. So she isn't just meek and mild, she's really interesting. And the third reason I picked her is the connection with Caxton. Caxton, the first English printer. The first book was printed probably in Ghent, I mean, Margaret of York was Caxton's patron, and one of the things we find very interesting about Caxton, and we explore in the book and in the exhibition, is Caxton's own work, his own translations from Dutch to English. The celebrated Reinout the Fox, in that wonderful retelling there, that was the book that was personally translated by Caxton after he'd spent 30 years in the Low Countries. So I've spent 30 years in this country, so I think of Caxton as the guy who went the other way. So I feel me and Caxton, we're like this. So that's why I picked that one, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. You will be able to see in the exhibition as well how we have Caxton's first printed book, or first publication. He wasn't allowed to print it himself, being an Englishman in Flanders, so he must have had someone else print it for him. But you can actually compare the letters of this manuscript and of the first printed book as well, which will be nice. Bart, can we have the next slide? Yes.
Yeah, so this is Fisher's panorama of London, completed in 1616, and it's probably the image of Renaissance London that I have before me as I write every day. And I love the fact that it is, completed in 1616, the year of Shakespeare's death. And we've already talked about the way in which my kind of literary interest in Renaissance England kind of starts with the figure of Edmund Spenser, whose first work, the 1568 Theatre for Worldlings, was as a result of kind of connection with Dutch art and Dutch poetry. He was working on a translation of Jan van den Hout's Het Theater of het Toneel, which is a kind of gruesomely, really should be part of the exhibition, I have to say, a gruesomely illustrated kind of Calvinist apocalyptic tract that shows the coming of the end of the world, with a series of visions of the fall of Rome and the coming of beasts with heads and so on. And for me, that first work of Spenser's, buying into that reformist, apocalyptic poetics is where I kind of start, and I end in 1616 with this moment of Shakespeare's death and this panorama of the Netherlands, of London. And I always like to kind of situate all of these kind of great Renaissance writers in relation to that panorama, to think of, John Donne operating in the Inns of Court that we see, in the kind of far west of that panorama, to think of, the whole book market there around St. Paul's that we see at the centre of the painting or the engraving, and then to think of Shakespeare's theatre, the Globe, brilliantly illustrated in the foreground in Southwark. And I guess for me, it also makes me think about the different ways in which the Renaissance happened for the United Kingdom versus the Netherlands, and where we think of the Golden Age. And I think that wouldn't have been obvious to someone like Jan van der Noot when he kind of arrived in 1568. It wouldn't have been obvious that the direction of the Renaissance in England would fundamentally be literary, that we would see English poetry become a kind of defining national characteristic, that very quickly in succession after Spenser we get, Marlowe, Donne, Shakespeare, Milton not long after, and that, the Netherlands with its golden age would really be visual, that we think of the Dutch golden age through, Rembrandt, all these other masters of the 17th century. And I think there's just a kind of rather nice paradox in the way that you end up seeing the English literary Renaissance through the eyes of Dutch artists in a panorama like this.
I think that's fascinating, and something I would like to explore in our conversation as well.
Yeah.
How some things play out seemingly similar, but then are actually very different. Sorry.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying about how these things played out differently is very interesting, particularly when you see that, yes, this is a view of 1616 London, but it is made by an engraver who probably never saw London.
Yeah, that's a wonderful kind of element of these things never being quite what they seem at the first moment.
That's really wonderful. Thank you very much. Emily, can I turn to you, and can I have the next slide, please?
George, I have to tell you that we seem to have lost Emily's sound, so she can't hear you.
Okay.
And also her picture. So we've run into a bit of technical difficulty for Emily, so our heart goes out to her, but we're working on it.
Okay, shall I?
Maybe if you move on to your slide.
If we go to my slide, and then we hope that we can go to Emily after mine. So yeah, this is my chosen object, and it's a passage of verse from folios 74 verso and 75 recto of manuscript Marshall 29. And it describes a North Sea crossing in the late 1340s. I've translated this bit, and I'll read it out to you. I won't serve you with some Middle Dutch. A virtuous, reliable and honourable man told me that a ship came from England intending to cross over to Zeeland, for it was originally from Briel. He swore on his soul that what I will tell you here was all true. There were more than 20 brave men on that ship. When they came to sea, they saw a large horse coming towards them over the water, ridden by a man who appeared angry. They were all astonished because the horse trod over the water, which was so vast and so deep. When the man approached them, he said, "Do not be afraid of me. You will not be harmed." One of the people on the ship said, "We see you riding over the water, which is a marvel to us." The rider said, "I am death, who cannot be avoided by anyone whom God once killed. I come from France and from other countries where I've carried out the order that God our Lord gave me. Now I travel to England to do God's desire." At the same moment, they lost sight of him and the vision ended. They did not know how. I chose this object because the rich layers of Anglo-Dutch literary heritage it encapsulates is really representative of the kind of choices we made in bringing the exhibition together. As we selected our exhibition items, in the great majority of cases, we chose objects that each could represent more than one single aspect of the literary heritage of Anglo-Dutch relations. Each object contains a layered history of contacts across the North Sea. The text describes a North Sea crossing and describes how such a crossing could be an occasion of meetings with new people, or in this case, disease. The passage was written by an author whose life was impacted by North Sea crossings too. Antwerp city clerk Jan van Boendalen. Boendalen also worked for Duke John III of Brabant, but also further undertook work for King Edward III of England when the royal court was stationed in Brabant in 1339-1340. He further wrote a chronicle in Dutch about King Edward III. The item also gives an insight in how much there still is to discover for researchers. During our preparations for the exhibition, and unfortunately too late for the book, but on time for the captioning of the exhibition, Era Gordeau published her remarkable discovery that Boondalen himself even visited England as Duke John's ambassador. So we're still discovering things here. Another layer of Anglo-Dutch history is provided by the manuscript's provenance, which is closely linked to the Bodleian Library's early history. The manuscript was donated to the Bodleian Library by the library's early benefactor, Thomas Marshall, who was a chaplain to the English merchant adventurers in the Netherlands, as well as a collaborator of Franciscus Junius in his linguistic research. And you'll be able to see some things about Junius and Marshall in the exhibition as well. And finally, there's the text unexpected bearing on our present day. We already selected this particular passage from the manuscript before the beginning of 2020, for the reasons I've just given. Yet having a vivid description of a pandemic crossing the North Sea in our exhibition feels particularly appropriate now. Do we have Emily now?
Yes, we're just going to message her. She will be able to speak and we'll be able to hear her.
Okay.
So,
So,
I know it's about her.
yes, and if we can go to the previous slide, please. Yeah.
It's amazing how tricky this is proving.
Yeah.
It's become pretty normal these days.
Yeah, Emily, can you hear me? You can hear me, maybe.
Yes, hi.
Yes, and I can hear
just
you.
lost sound.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, sorry about that. I'm afraid I missed what you said before now. I had no sound, but I will push on.
Thank you.
I just see black on my screen, but luckily I have a printout of the object that I wanted to discuss in front of me. So why don't I go ahead, and if you have questions, please interrupt me.
Thank you.
And not surprisingly, I suppose I chose the oil sketch by Anthony van Dyck of Franciscus Junius the Younger for all kinds of reasons. First of all, although I love to read, I am an art historian, so I like to look even more. And so this was one of the really great images in the selection. Ah, and I can see you. Oh, I can see myself. Great. And why I selected this was, obviously, Anthony van Dyck is so incredibly important in the visual culture of England, especially in the Caroline Court. It's sort of unthinkable without him. And this image is very much the type that he did, I think, when he was closest to his sitter. It's an oil sketch. And it resembles very closely the oil sketches that Van Dyck made for his so-called iconography. It was to be a whole set of prints that were made after these oil sketches of people who were important artists and people important in the arts. And although this was not made for that iconography, so far as I know, I'll come on to what it was used for. It's very much in that sphere, monochrome, quite loosely painted, very intimate in feeling, and the head in particular is a very sensitive rendering. I think you'll all agree. Van Dyck was hugely productive during his English period, and so he often used assistants to complete some parts of it. And I would expect that this one, it looks like the lower half, particularly the hand, which is a little more wooden, may have well been done by someone in his studio. But the head is very much Van Dyck himself with that spontaneity. Now, there was certainly a connection to be made between Van Dyck and Junius. As you know, Junius was the author of a very important book, particularly for artists, called De Pictura Veterum, or the Painting of the Ancients. And his very first, the manuscript was in fact dedicated to Charles I. And we know that Van Dyck actually wrote to Junius on the 14th of August, 1636, giving his compliments. Subsequently, an English edition appeared, and a Dutch edition appeared in 1641, which is the year of Van Dyck's death. And in that Dutch edition was a print of the picture I think you probably all have on screen at the moment. So although we can't be 100% sure that Van Dyck knew, he probably didn't know the Dutch version, but he certainly knew of this. And this was to become a hugely important work to Dutch artists as well, interested in the art of the ancients. So here you have two successful. Junius himself was obviously, he's actually born in Heidelberg, but grew up in Leiden, actually. Was brought up there, and left the Netherlands. He studied theology and left the Netherlands. Had to do with the very complicated debate of the Protestant faith at the time. And he left the Netherlands and traveled around and was later employed by Thomas Howard, Earl of Arundel. And Arundel was also a great patron of Van Dyck. So here you have these Dutchmen who arrive in England, who actually achieve the summit, who really are at the very height of the Caroline court, and the people around them within their specialism. Junius as a scholar and Van Dyck as a painter. And it would have been fascinating to be a fly on the wall and to hear their observation, how they met each other, what their observations would have been of the English as we started off in our panel, our own observations, these sorts of cross-cultural exchanges. Incidentally, of course, Junius left, was also a collector and left a large collection of manuscripts to the University of Oxford. So there's another nice little link that brings everything together. So well done for having this object in the exhibition.
Thank you, Emily. I'm pleased to say that indeed we have the Keitman manuscript on display, as well as Junius's own edition of it, annotated by himself for his later work, which never appeared, the glossary of the manuscript. I think the Arundels sound like a fascinating family to write a long history of. I think there are several generations of North Sea Cousins as well, right?
Absolutely, and some of Van Dyck's greatest portraits were Arundel, and several versions with his grandson as well.
Would they have commissioned this portrait for Junius or something? Who would have paid for this?
Yeah, this is a bit of a mystery. We don't know whether this. I certainly don't know whether this sketch was a commission for the manuscript. It may well have been. That we don't know. It certainly didn't seem to. It certainly wasn't didn't end up in the iconography. So it seems to have a slightly separate status.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. So with that, we arrive, and I'm hoping that we now have the audio sorted and remain part of this conversation that follows now. We arrive at the third part of our conversation today, in which we will invite also participation of the audience here in the room and online. And thinking about the exhibition, we would like to explore its significance in establishing a new account of Anglo-Dutch relations in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, but also its bearing on Anglo-Dutch relations today and in the future, and maybe the bearing of these relations on the exhibition as well, to a certain extent. I would like to invite the audience to raise questions. Those of you at home can do so by leaving a comment in the YouTube chat, or by emailing to events@bodleian.ox.ac.uk. That is events@bodleian.ox.ac.uk. So either in the YouTube chat or that email address, you can send your questions, and I'll get them here on my little screen, and I'll try to pick up on those as well. I think we started with a question from the ambassador about Hebben alle Vogelen, and I think it is right to start with that. It is right to start with that also because that manuscript, which when you walk into the room will look rather scruffy, because it really is a page of pen trials, people trying out the new cut nibs of their pens. It doesn't look like much, but it is unique that we can have it in the exhibition here. It has been, as far as I know, on display, public display, only once before, and that was at the second centenary of the Dutch Royal Library. That was the probably only time that this manuscript has ever left the Bodleian, since it was taken into the collections here. And it is such a central manuscript to the history of early Dutch that the second centenary of the Dutch Royal Library was seen as a reason to get that manuscript to the Netherlands. So there's good reason to start with that. And then the riddle becomes, sorry, Lisbeth wants to say something about this.
Now, I just wanted to answer the question of the ambassador. How on earth is it possible that monks wrote about such seemingly explicit sexual longing if they were supposed to be celibate? And I think we mustn't forget that although the monks in monasteries and indeed nuns were indeed leading a celibate life, they are still responsible for the transmission of both lyrics and prose text, both from the classical period and from authors of the early Middle Ages, that are engaged with feelings that are common to all of us. So it shouldn't really be a surprise that monks and nuns dealt with this material and wrote about it.
Thank you, Lisbeth. I think that's I think that's a really crucial point for understanding this, as far as we can understand this little fragment, right? I think a really good way of looking at that. I think indeed Fritz van Oostrom has his own theories. There are arguments also about it being a fragment of a song that someone once heard. So it can have all these layers of potential meaning. I don't know whether Ad has anything to...
No, I have nothing to add really to it. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, but I think there's another question coming from...
Question as a comment from another medievalist for the ambassador, that the number of injunctions about behaviour in monasteries suggests that these rules were observed in the breach very often. And there is a well-known book about gay people in the Middle Ages, and much of the material there was probably written by monks and clerics. So I think we can assume that the rules are one thing, but lived life was something different for many of them. Not all of them, obviously, but for some of them.
I think there's really a lot of aspects of life caught up in that one little fragment of text. I think that is really interesting because...
I have a slight addition. It's a little bit of a later period, but there's quite a lot of printmaking, first German and then Rembrandt himself, that shows monks and nuns engaging in all kinds of activities that you can bear.
I think that's true. I think one of the things that fascinates me about this particular fragment is that it's not only Old Dutch, it also has Latin around it. It has an immediate Latin translation. And it is written in between all kinds of fragments of Latin, including a number of times, I'm trying out my pen, I'm trying out my pen, I'm trying out my ink, I'm trying out my pen, including by the same scribe, by the way. And what for me is most fascinating about it is that the script of the manuscript shines through the parchment. It is not a flyleaf as such, it is the final leaf of the text which has remained blank. So you have the text, you turn it over and you have this blank leaf. And English is written with different letters than Latin in this period. So you can see the English of the manuscript shining through this text. It was not the first sentence of Old Dutch. Old Dutch was occasionally written already, but it was much rarer to have Dutch written in this period than English. English writing had a much more established tradition already by this time. And to see this monk in this place with this manuscript in English and then think, okay, let me write something in Dutch as well, is really, I think, a really interesting multilingual moment as well. Richard would like to add something.
I wanted to ask a question, if I may,
Yes.
which is, you know, the exhibition is very much about the Dutch or Netherlandish cultural and intellectual presence in England. What were Dutch men and women reading English texts in the Netherlands at this time?
Well, I mean, this is one of the things I like about Middle English is that no one cared a hoot about the language. You know, English is now the international language, and everyone speaks it. Now, I think we have to, going back to the period, we have to imagine a time when actually no one apart from the English had English. So, did they read it? Well, there are some snippets of Middle English that travel. They are bits of songs, and it was probably the music that the words came, as it were, as hostages to the music, that travelled in that way. Then I think the fascinating thing is that the English printers, the Dutch printers, when Caxton dies, see an opportunity. And I think the first move, as it were, of English becoming an international language, we can see in the printers of the Low Countries who take that language and start producing books in English for the English market. And so the rise of English as an international language has this fascinating history. And I think sort of there's the Low Countries have an interesting part to play in that.
I think I would like to qualify that in one respect, in that maybe the texts in English didn't get disseminated in the Low Countries, or at least much. English stories in Latin, on the other hand, were hugely popular, and particularly the stories of Arthur and the stories of Brutus as the founder of Britain were so popular that they were even incorporated in Dutch narratives as well. And one example, which we have in the exhibition, is that one of the early foundation myths of Britain is that the Trojan Brutus came to Britain, found an island inhabited by giants, threw them off the island, and then made called it Britain after himself. Right? This is a story. Dutch chroniclers at some point come up with the story that these giants that were thrown off the island actually swam to the Dutch, like the North Sea coast, and then started there and became the first inhabitants of Holland.
That's only as a troll.
Yes. Maybe the English language, not so much. English narratives, on the other hand.
There's a sort of interesting rider to that. English players travelled quite widely on the continent, including to the Netherlands. And you have William Kemp, Shakespeare's first comic lead actor, the person who was the first Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream and the first Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing, performed extensively in the Netherlands, but before he met Shakespeare, before he started doing Shakespeare's plays. So the tradition of English playing that had a significant influence in the Netherlands was one of mime and dance and jigs and so on, and music. So yeah, it's kind of odd that you've got that gap of the language really not very strikingly making an impact, I think.
Yeah. Maybe Emily can add a little bit on the court culture of English migrants in the Netherlands. Do you have an idea of, like, when the Arundels, for example, were in the Netherlands, did they use English at all, or was it all French that they used to?
I think they were mostly, I suppose in England, the Dutch would have to adapt and use the local vernacular, but these people were, Arundels, for example, traveled quite extensively.
Yeah.
And there you would have Latin, French. I expect French would be the lingua. Sorry about my cough. I it's interesting when you're thinking about exchanging. One of the things that you probably all know is that the transmission of culture in terms of visual culture was very much from the Netherlands to England. I mean, it's really striking to see how little homegrown talent there was, really going back to Holbein, but under Hans Ewert is really the first Dutch painter who set his roots down. And was also really interesting is that it was almost all portraiture. There was a little bit of landscape painting later on. These were mostly people who emigrated for religious reasons. They came, they found a market, and it was really later, much later, well after Van Dyck and the Caroline period, that you see this huge influx of you see more Dutch painters coming, and then really the homegrown talent starting. And I often think the reason I'm saying this is that it seems to me that the Dutch were very good with the visual side, bringing that to the UK. And what I'm learning from you is that the stories went the other way, and you still see that today. But the Dutch are very good with graphic design and that sort of thing, and you're still seeing that exchange. It's still somewhat localized where the specialism is, and it's so interesting to look way back and to see that it has very, very deep roots. It goes back a long way.
That's great. Yeah. Thanks. I saw a question there. Maybe you can bring the microphone. Yes.
Thanks a lot to all of you for bringing all these material together. I've two short questions. One is on multilingualism, and one is on the role of religion and especially mysticism. My name is Henrike Leinemann. I'm professor here of medieval German literature and linguistics, and I'm working on bilingual writing in Low German and Latin in northern Germany. And I was wondering how much of Low German also travels across with a Anglo-Dutch relationship, because that would have been used as a lingua franca of the Hanseatic trade. So in London, in the contour, there would have been Low German as an intermediate language, or a sister language both of Middle Dutch and medieval English. And I just don't know how much you can find of that also in the manuscripts you have been dealing with. And on the also in the bilingual texts I'm dealing with, it's quite often that particular secular songs are quoted as a route into then a religious transformation. So quoting a dance song and saying, oh, how much better it is to dance with Jesus than, and I could very well see the little pen trial belonging in some such context. And that brings me to the question about also the roots of Devotio Moderna and mysticism across the North Sea, but also wider around the North Sea up to Scandinavia, also across to northern Germany, and how much you've seen of this Devotio Moderna crossing into England.
I think really, really important questions, and questions we've tried to walk around with the exhibition. In so far that, for example, Cologne plays a significant role in our exhibition, and in the lives of a number of the people in the book as well, particularly Jan Veldener, who made the type for, like the typographer who made the type for Caxton, and who printed the only medieval Dutch Chronicle of England. He was from Cologne. More than later, he was also from Flanders, and he was also from Utrecht. So Cologne is really very much part of the cultural space that we're talking about already. There isn't so much of a division there, I think, in many ways. The other problem that we have is we've been talking about how Dutch stands for the Dutch language and an area larger than what is the Netherlands now, and even an area that's larger than what is the Netherlands and Flanders now, because it pushed further down to the south. England, when it took Calais, had a language border with Dutch at Calais, right? But of course the word Dutch doesn't mean only Dutch, it also means German. So that complicates a lot further. That said, I think quite usually in the text that I'm encountering, people know quite well what they're talking about, whether they're talking about Dutch or about German, and they seem to distinguish between the two quite clearly, even when they use the same word for the two, which is interesting. That's not an answer to your question, I realize, but it is an answer that indicates the relevance of your question, I think, to this kind of research. I don't know whether there are others.
Just add a few interesting things coming out of my current research. There was a group of Flemings who had a guild in Florence, the weavers. Their scribe was in fact Dutch, he was German, what we now call German. And these people could obviously communicate very easily. I don't think they distinguished their languages in any way. And then my Dutch hat makers that I'm currently obsessing about, they wrote their statutes of their guild in Dutch and English. One of the scribes is very hard to place because he's on the border, on the German border, and you think, is this, in that area, is this Dutch, is this English, is this Dutch, is this German? It's just very hard to say. So, and sometimes, of course, the word that they used for these, at least in the Latin record, Teutonics, could include Germans. So it's very murky.
I think we need to unfortunately start wrapping up. I have a lot that I still wanted to raise myself, but I want to thank Bart and Emily for joining us here, and I want to thank all of you for being here with us today in the room and online. Some of you will have logged on from across the North Sea, and I'm speaking to you for a second now because I know some of you would have liked to join us here today, and we're not able to in large part because of the current circumstances of the pandemic. To you, I would like to alert you that we will have a small satellite exhibition, or it's actually increasing in size, it's not so small anymore, at the University of Amsterdam, at Albert Pierson, from March. So do, if you're in the Netherlands, come and visit us there. We will there also present a Dutch translation of the exhibition book, which will come out also in March. So to the Dutch speakers among you in the audience online, you can buy our book twice. It will come out with Amsterdam University Press. Meanwhile, I want to invite everyone here and everyone watching to join us at the exhibition and to read our exhibition book, and to join us at our conference on the 6th to the 8th of January here at the Bodleian, for which you can find the details on the Bodleian website. And to read Anne-Louise Avery's Reinhardt books. She now has two. One a retelling of Caxton's Reinhardt, and one filled with a notebook with 10 news stories written by Anne. And hoping that all of this together will be fertile ground for much future thinking about Anglo-Dutch relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the broadcast. We've come to the end of this stage of the private viewing. And it only remains for me to thank the panel, and particularly, I think, to Emily for enduring the technological challenges so extremely professionally, and coming up with her participation absolutely right on cue and in a perfect manner. We wish you could have joined us. We have a convivial element of the evening still to come. We're exceedingly grateful to His Excellency, the Dutch Ambassador, for coming and opening the exhibition with us. We're very grateful to him indeed, because we know how busy he is. It only remains for me to invite you to join me in the usual way in thanking the panel. But just before then, I'd like to reflect that all of our participants this evening have some kind of antiquarian sort of investigative and curiosity that's informed them in their research. And it calls to mind that great book written by John Earle in the early 17th century called The Microcosmography, where he tries to convey how passionate antiquaries were about old books. And he does that by saying that antiquaries love old books as Dutchmen do cheese. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the panel.